Good afternoon, welcome, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar entitled Ethics Considerations in Our Changing Environment. My name is Mike Hoffner, Managing Partner at McConley & Asbury, and with me today is Janice Snyder, Partner and our Director of Assurance Services. We are extremely glad to have the chance to spend the next hour with you on our annual Fall Ethics webinar. Some of you may have joined us before. We're glad to see you back and thankful for all of you that could make it. For those of us, I guess I should be advancing the slides here before they yell at me. So there we are. There's Mike, there's Janice. Now I'm going to move on. For those who aren't familiar with the firm, just want to take a moment. McConley & Asbury is a full-service accounting and consulting firm. Clients throughout the region are served through our 3 offices here in Camp Hill, where Janice and I are primarily based, and out of Lancaster and Bloomsburg as well. We provide core services in assurance, tax, client accounting services, as well as a number of consulting and advisory services. For those of you who aren't as familiar with the firm outside of these webinars that we do and don't know the breadth and depth of the service lines we offer, I would invite you to visit our website at www.macpas.com and learn a little bit more about us. Before we get started on today's content, I wanted to just mention if you have questions during the webinar, please submit them through the questions function in your webinar control panel. We will do our best to answer them during the webinar or at the end, and if we don't get to them and they are particularly of interest to you, we will circle back via an email and try and answer to the best we can. The other thing I want to point out, there will be 3 polling questions throughout. For those of you who need to obtain CPE for this webinar, it is important that you watch for those polling questions and answer them. That is one way we track attendance for CPE, but the questions also allow us to get a better understanding of our audience, of what you're looking for, and things that we can maybe steer our conversation towards to help you. So with that, Janice, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick things off.
Great. Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here this afternoon. As he said, my name is Janice Snyder, and I just wanted to start off with a slide on unprecedented change. I was thinking about this, and I wonder how many of you, when you were planning and budgeting and forecasting out, looking at 2020, predicted a global pandemic. I know I certainly did not. But here's a bunch of headlines. Most of them are pretty much just from the month of March. And it just sort of sets the stage for how much has changed and how quickly it has changed. I know after 6 months of this, I left my house last week once without a mask. And I couldn't believe after so many months that I forgot the mandatory masks for those of us here in Pennsylvania, as I think a lot of you are. And it's certainly a lot to think about, not only personally, but within our businesses. So we're going to talk today about how some of these changing headlines and changes to our businesses can affect ethics in our work environment. So we're going to start. Here is our agenda for today for the ethics considerations in our changing environment. And we're going to start with a few slides on tone at the top. And then we're going to move into a few things you should be considering about working in a remote environment. And then we're going to go on to a couple of case studies, so some real practical examples, and talk about some things that play in the gray area. And is your organization addressing those items? So hopefully we can keep you a little bit entertained this afternoon as we all get our ethics CPE. So starting it off with tone at the top. So what does the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct say about the tone at the top? And it's here emphasizing a commitment to fair financial reporting and compliance with applicable laws, rules, regulations, and corporate governance policies. Of course, I know you can read that. But in terms of the corporate governance policies, it goes on to say that there's a professional responsibility or right to disclose information, when not prohibited by law, of course, and to report potential concerns regarding those questionable accounting, auditing, or other matters that could be happening within your companies. Hopefully they're not, but we're all faced with ethical dilemmas on a daily basis, and we need to be considering those in light of our code of conduct and in our behaviors. So we went on a little bit further to say, what does the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, as you're thinking about fraud and things that could happen, say about tone at the top? And it refers to the ethical atmosphere within your organization. So what is the tone that you're creating throughout your workplace, and what is being demonstrated by your organization's leadership? So when I take this and look at the code, the term ethics is mentioned over 150 times in the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct. It's certainly something that is top of mind and certainly something they want our professionals to be focused on. And within that, it goes further to talk about the integrity principle. So integrity is an element of character fundamental to professional recognition, and it is the quality from which the public trust derives and the benchmark against which a member must ultimately test all decisions. So we certainly need to be thinking, am I doing what a person of integrity would do, and have I retained my integrity on a daily basis as we make tremendous decisions each and every day, right? So whatever tone management sets will trickle down to the rest of your employees and throughout the company. And so if you're setting that ethical tone with the highest level of integrity, your employees will be more likely to uphold those same values. And you'll see us talk a little bit later, that's going to be much, much more important in a remote environment that many of you may be working in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk a little about an ethical organization.
Yeah, thank you, Janice. I think it's critical to continue this conversation about tone at the top, and we can do this through a couple of key areas we're going to talk about here for the next few minutes. A lot of organizations say that they have a strong culture of ethics, whether it's on the wall or not, whether it is in the core values or not. Organizations all over say, yeah, we have great people, high integrity, high ethics. But it needs to go beyond just saying you're an organization with high ethical standards. You need to understand how you're defining what that means. You need to think about how you're keeping it front of mind for all your employees. We need to make sure we're understanding how we're training new employees in the way that we do things, and really think critically about what we're doing to ensure that we live by what we think is obvious. And these things don't happen by accident. So there's an article in the June of 2019 Harvard Business Review, which is really actually quite an excellent article on creating or designing an ethical organization. And we've tried to pull out and capture some of the key tenets from that article here to talk about today. I would invite you, it's a quick Google search to go find it. I believe you get 2 articles free from them as they try and entice you into a subscription. So you definitely can go read this one unless you are have already used your 2. But things we want to talk about today. We want to talk about the way that you as an organization are making explicit to your employees the values with which you live by. This idea of what the leadership team says and how that is conveyed and just really drilled into the team that is working for you. So I think the first place to start in my mind is a really clearly drafted statement of values. How do you put into words who you are and what you expect of all of your team? And as you put that into words, it starts to really reinforce the ideas that you're trying to capture. I think many of us have gone through an effort of trying to identify a new mission statement or identify revised core values. And what happens so often is as you start to put them on paper, you start to realize that there's maybe a little bit of a misunderstanding among different members in the organization as to what exactly you're trying to get at or what exactly you're trying to say. Or you might be actually on different sides of the aisle when it comes to particular areas. So putting it on paper and working through how do we say our principles, how do we commonly discuss them is a really critical exercise. And as you get those into words, I think it's pretty critical to take a real focused effort at training. Often business ethics is focused on compliance. And we spend a lot of time, and Janice and I have talked about this annual webinar we do on ethics. What do we talk about? We talk about compliance, we talk about programs, we talk about the code of professional conduct and what that means. I think that's pretty common. What we don't always do is really internally spending enough time talking about the ethical values of the entity and training our teams how to have awareness of their individual tendencies to rationalize dilemmas. I'm in an ethical dilemma. It's easy to go one way or the other, and you can always rationalize a direction. But are you providing your team with a framework with which to consider how they think through those dilemmas. And does that framework really tie back to your statement of principles? Your employees should easily be able to see how ethical principles influence the company's practices. Again, tone at the top. If they see the leadership of an organization acting in a way that is in alignment with what leadership is saying, it's much easier to expect your team to uphold the same ethical standards. It's interesting too, when we talk about words mattering and really getting the right words on this statement of principles and a mission statement. In the article, if you take the time to read it, you'll find one particular statistic. I found it fascinating. There was an experiment done where participants played an economic game with a partner. And in that game, 70% of the participants cooperated for mutual gain when the game was titled a community game. But when they changed the name of the game, not the game itself, but when they changed the name of the game and called it the Wall Street game, only 30% of the individuals cooperated for mutual gain. So again, words matter. Are we saying the right things when we try and define our organizational focus on ethics? So the final thing on the explicit values component, I think it's important that you take time and link your hiring, firing, and promotion and incentive decisions to those stated values. So before I move on to our next point, Janice, anything you want to add there?
Just to emphasize, Mike, that words really do matter. That's what resonated with me, and all those things you said, and those little nuances in the context of that is really going to drive your tone at the top as well as your culture. So I think being really cognizant of those words and how you're using them and the words you're choosing could make a big difference in your explicit values.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about how we think through things as we take a course of action. So thoughts during judgment. Whether the company, as I said, whether the company has integrity as a stated core value or it's written into a mission statement or not, it's critical, absolutely critical for senior leadership of the organization to reiterate the importance of integrity and ethics as a frequent and intentional commentary and discussion point. The training will help, and what you really need to step back and think about in today's world, and we'll talk more a little bit later about this idea of a virtual environment, is what are you doing differently to reinforce how people think through ethical dilemmas when they're working in an environment, potentially in a work environment that is completely different from what they were working in just 8 months ago. And are we helping our employees think through, as they're faced with these dilemmas, what's different in this circumstance than it might have been when I was working in my office? I think it's easy for employees to discern those obvious black and white, right and wrong decisions. Employees face those all the time. Our teams face those. Leadership faces those. It's easy to make that decision when there is an obvious right and wrong answer. But if we're not encouraging and training and developing our teams to keep ethical considerations at the front of their mind when they're making decisions, then we're not giving them the tools they need when they get into those gray areas. We still will make decisions in those gray areas. We still will find the right answer, hopefully, but it becomes a lot easier to rationalize into the darker gray, if you will, if we're not teaching and empowering our teams to really keep that ethical framework in the front of mind as they're making judgments on these decisions. So if you keep ethics at the center of attention in your corporate culture, those lapses can absolutely be reduced. Another thing to think about is what you as an organization prioritize. Enron is a great example. Enron's #1 focus and prioritization, to the point where they hung it in the elevators, they hung it all over the building. Enron's focus was on stock price first. Right? So when your focus is absolutely and utterly on one thing, and that thing is maximization of profits and growth to drive stock price, is that illegal? Absolutely not. But does it incent employees and drive ethical behavior by keeping the right things at the front of mind? Or does it drive behavior and incent employees by thinking, all right, I need to move a little further into the gray, because if I move a little further into the gray on this ethical decision, I might actually be able to move the needle on something, whether it's right or wrong. If it's gray and that's the focus, I'm going to do it. So remember to talk about the right things and empower and encourage your employees to focus on the right things by making the right things the priority and focus.
I think you're right, Mike. I think you have to need to remember we can't control people's thoughts, though, but we can create an event that someone is willing to go talk it through with somebody else, with teamwork, to say, hey, what do you think of this? To reach out and get support in making sure they're making ethical decisions every day. So I think that would go a long way.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to move on to the incentives component of this discussion, which I think when we talk about incentives, we think often about money and financial incentive, right? That's where the mind goes. But when we incentivize our teams to do the right thing and enact the right behavior, that's only part of it. It needs to go beyond that. People care about meaningful work. People care about making a positive impact on those around you. And we need to link the ethical decisions we're making to the meaning of our work and to the meaning of how we're serving our customers and our clients and our colleagues. And those are things that it's not always easy to talk about. It's easy to default to the simple, how do we build an incentive plan to reward people through financial compensation? But it needs to be beyond that. We need to set the right expectations in terms of behavior when it comes to ethics as well. It's very easy for us to sit back and terminate an employee for unethical behavior. I doubt there is anybody on our call who's listening in today who would say if they identified a significant unethical behavior in an employee, they would keep them employed, right? It's just sort of a given. We talk about it, it's easy. But I would invite you to consider how as an organization you can also focus on the positive. How do you highlight, reward, and incentivize those positive decisions that are made by employees? It is not easy. The first thing you need to do is find out about them. It's very difficult to find out those instances where you know an employee was faced with an ethical dilemma and yet they made the right decision. But I would encourage you to explore the opportunity to do that, whether that is through an opportunity for their colleagues and their peers to share stories, whether it's for an encouragement of employees to come forward as a way of training and say, I was faced with this decision and my peers might be faced with the same one, and here's what I did. It allows the company to determine a training plan or a process. But the first step is really trying to understand, how do you identify employees making those right decisions when, as Janice had said, you can't control how someone thinks, you just presume they're going to think the right way. So if you identify those, then it's a matter of incentivizing others to behave the same way. It's a matter of trying to identify how you link that right decision to a positive impact, how you respect the efforts that somebody put forth in making the right decision, even if it might have cost the organization a contract, it might have cost money. Those right decisions, they need to be enhanced and celebrated as an incentive to give people to make them. Ethical cultures not only do good, they feel good, and we need to make sure people understand that and see that in how we operate. So, Janice, anything before I move on to cultural norms?
When I think of incentives, we all know the saying, you get what you pay for. But this goes a little bit further to say, as Mike said, you get what you recognize and what you reward, and recognizing and rewarding those ethical behaviors will go a long way for these incentives. I think they'll really help your organization.
Yeah, I wish we could give the perfect example of how to do that, but it is extremely difficult to figure out, and it's organization by organization, it will be different. So cultural norms are really those things in your organization that represent how the peers of your employees actually behave. So we can set ethical standards and have tone at the top that is first class, but reality is the behavior of our employees is dictated by, as they say in the article, they use the phrase, which I really liked, the tone in the middle. So we can dictate policy, we can set the right examples, we can carry tone at the top, but behavior is dictated by how the tone in the middle is carried. And the norms really, the cultural norms we're talking about are really those things where how does the middle behave? When somebody sits in your organization and looks at those around them, are they seeing how others behave, and is it in alignment with how you are training, teaching, and incentivizing your employees to behave? Because I can tell you, if they're seeing others taking shortcuts and they're seeing others being rewarded for the wrong things, and they're seeing others do things that they know are kind of in that dark gray area, if you will, that becomes the culture of the organization. So we need to figure out how to make sure the cultural norms, the way people actually behave, are the things that we want, expect, and are demanding of our team. We need to focus on the good that people are doing. We need to make sure that we share those good stories, we look for those good stories, and we try and make sure that where those individuals who might be driving the cultural norms to a place where, as a leadership team, you don't want them, you're ceasing that effort, you're stopping it, you're intervening, and whether that means a termination or a behavioral action plan for someone to change their attitude, their mentality, it's really about being keenly aware of that tone in the middle and what that might be doing to the ethical mindset of the rest of your organization. So with that,
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to our first question. Which please take the opportunity to answer. Again, if you're looking for CPE, you need to do these. So the question is, which aspect of the pandemic has most significantly impacted your organization? Working remotely, the new requirements for masking, social distancing, limitation of visitors in your building. Is it the new funding sources, or is it business shutdowns and closings? Now, everybody's going to interpret the question differently. The question is about what is the most significant impact on your organization. Look, I get it if you want to read it as what is the thing that I've been most irritated by during the pandemic. And if you choose to answer it that way, absolutely fine.
I think we can all relate to that.
We all can, and we might all have a similar answer to what's bothered us the most. Let's look at and talk about what has had the most significant impact organizationally among those four things. And Janice and I will try and maybe shift our conversation a little bit as we go.
Yeah, and I definitely think we could see some differences from different industries. Certainly some industries are affected more than others by the shutdowns. And I think you have about 10 more seconds to answer this question. So we won't get the industry insight from the group answers here, but we will get to see the trend. 5 more seconds to answer the question.
And you're done. Hopefully you got your answer in there. So looks like the most significant impact of the things we had asked is working remotely, which is, I think, in alignment with our expectations as we thought through where we were going to go with this discussion. The new requirements clearly have impacted some of you in a way that is significant, and I imagine some of that may be industry specific and how you have to do business. The new funding sources are a positive, I think, for many of you, so therefore maybe didn't rise in terms of significant impact. And of course, business shutdowns and closing, I'm sure a few of you are feeling that far more painfully than others. But we are going to dive into working remotely as really a key focus area for the next few minutes of our discussion. So I'm really glad, because we'd had to change slides very quickly if you'd have answered differently. So I'm really glad that the majority answered that way. So we just want to take some time and talk about remote environments and some of the ethical considerations that really need to be front of mind as it relates to working in a remote environment. So cartoons, they're always a great thing to see. I prefer to focus on the Brady Bunch, and I only focus on that because honestly, who among us has not had those instances over the last few months where we've had a meeting with exactly 9 people and we've had this exact thought in our head? And I got to be honest, I chuckle pretty regularly during meetings when I see 2 people who are in different places happen to be side by side on my screen, and they're both looking, one's looking to the left, one's looking to the right, and they're gazing into each other's eyes, kind of like, you know, Carol and Marsha Brady. And I just have to laugh. And I know we've all had those experiences, but we're not here to talk about Zoom meetings, although there are probably some implications related to that. We want to talk about ethical considerations in the remote environment more specifically. So in mid-March, the way we do business has changed really very drastically and dramatically at first. And we've all evolved and figured out since March how to do things differently. Most organizations that move to a remote work environment for some or all of their team have figured out how to do it, figured out very quickly, and are still very successfully fulfilling their mission. But we've also learned that with this rapid switch to a work from home mindset, virtual meetings, customer calls, things that we used to do in person or around conference tables are now done differently. The culture has shifted. And really what we want to spend a few minutes talking about is whether you've really shifted your attention and your focus on how that might impact policies, procedures, and things that guide ethical conduct to how things are different now than they were then. We're going to get into some case studies in a few minutes, but before we get into the case studies, we just want to highlight a few of the key points on this slide that we believe were more prevalent or more meaningful, more interesting maybe to discuss. So I'm going to start, and maybe Janice, we just go back and forth on a few of these, but I'm going to start in particular with employee engagement. And I want to just refer back to the conversation we just had regarding cultural norms. Employee engagement is absolutely critical, and it's very difficult to make sure that employees are engaged when you're not together. Seeing how others are working, making decisions, etc. All of those things, when we look around us and you think from an ethical standpoint, if I look at the person who's working next to me in the office, or I look to the person that I'm sitting, I'm on a trip with and meeting with an important customer, when I see how others behave, and I see that up close and in person, it influences my behavior. When I see someone doing good, I want to do good. When I see somebody doing something they shouldn't do, I'm hoping that I want to make it better. I want to make it right. I'm hoping the answer is not that I want to do poorly as well. But this idea of remote employees not seeing how others are behaving, it can be very, very difficult to ensure we're incenting the right behavior. So I think the important thing to consider when it comes to the remote environment and the ethical aspects of it is how are we keeping our employees engaged, and how are we allowing them to see the positive behavior in those around them that they're maybe not seeing in a real-time basis anymore. So something I really would challenge each of you to think about is how your employees may or may not rationalize those gray area decisions, and how you can ensure, again, I'm going back to the previous slide, how you get your employees engaged and active and interested in what's going on around them and seeing those positive behaviors, because when they see them, they tend to emulate them. So Janice, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk about one that you particularly were interested in.
Sure. I mean, employee engagement is certainly an important one and can go hand in hand with training, but I'm going to go up one above you there and go to employee onboarding and orientation. So when you're bringing employees into your organization, how has that changed? Are you now in a remote environment? Are you onboarding remotely? Are you trying to maintain a consistent message and consistent practice to those individuals coming in? How are they accessing your organization's leaders? Do you know what the leaders are thinking, and how are you communicating that to someone new? Maybe some of you have embraced this opportunity and said, this is fantastic. We've streamlined, we've organized, we've recorded videos, and everybody gets the exact same onboarding experience. But I would also think there are a lot of organizations out there still adjusting. There's a lot of things that have changed in the last 6 months. And have you been able to really focus on this to make sure you're communicating the tone at the top, and you're getting all the messages to all those remote employees that are joining your organizations? So that's the one I wanted to focus on. Mike, you got another burning one?
Yeah, lots of them, but we're in the interest of time, I won't talk about all of them. One that particularly resonates with me, and I'm going to sound a little bit obvious here, I guess, to the audience we have, who are largely involved in the accounting side, although I know many of you aren't. I want to talk about monitoring of controls. Is it a somewhat obvious statement to say our environment changed and the way we need to do things changed in March? Absolutely. My question and my challenge is simply to say, how did we organizationally react by improving, enhancing, or changing controls necessary for that changed work environment? So I'll give you an example, and it's an example that I think is fairly universal, and that is the example of accounts payable. So in a traditional, we're in the building every day kind of environment, check machines, check printing machines are in one place, blank check stocks in another. We have clear controls on reconciling the check numbers and all the things that are kind of obvious. Sometime long about probably between March 20th and 25th, every organization said, all right, we're not going back in the office anytime soon. This appears to be something that is going to last. I need to pay vendors, so we need to come up with a way to get checks cut. Now, some organizations brought AP folks back into the office to make it normal, but I know a lot of organizations unplugged the AP, the check machines, and sent them home because they knew they couldn't come into the office. They couldn't put people at risk. So the question is, now that that control environment that was in place with cash going out the building in the form of AP checks has changed dramatically. That check machine is no longer under controlled environment. The check stock needs to be with the person with the check machine at home. What did we do to make sure we've changed the controls? What did we do to make sure that all the things that we had protected now in a new environment are still being protected? So things like that. And every organization has dozens upon dozens of things that changed, but every organization also has dozens of things that stayed exactly the same, but we're in a different environment now. Some folks are home, some folks are in the office, some folks are doing a little bit of both. So how are we making sure that those checkpoints and controls that protect the integrity of the organization are still being done when people are in a different place? So this isn't something I think a lot of us worried about in the second half of March when we were trying to figure out how to do business. I would hope that the majority of us thought about it in April and said, we need to make sure we're doing it the right way. If we're sitting here in September and you're starting to feel a little hot under the collar and worried, I would invite you at the end of the webinar to start really brain dumping those systems and processes that you've changed and make sure you understand what controls are in place around them.
Nice. Mike, your monitoring of controls goes right in hand with the updates to processes that I wanted to talk about. So maybe you had to change a little bit your AP process and how you're doing the paper checks, but some organizations may have said, now's the time. We're going to go all electronic. We're going to use wires. We're going to use electronic funds transfers. We're going to use ACHs, whatever that may be. And then I think the questions become a little different. How is that being reviewed timely? What are the checks and balances? Who is approving that money leaving your bank accounts and leaving the organizations? How have you changed those processes, and how are you making sure there's sufficient and timely review of those items? And AP is just one example, but there could be so many other processes. Are you now accepting fewer checks and getting more wires and more EFTs coming into the organization in terms of accounts receivable and processing those cash receipts? And have you changed a lot of other processes? Maybe your accounting team would sit down at month-end close and talk about different reserves and estimates or allowances, and now you're not sitting in the same room or the same office. So how are you facilitating those discussions? How has your organization changed? And how have those processes need to change? Do you need different support or different evidence of those processes and different ways that you're reviewing things? And is your team interacting differently? So they're the things I think everyone should be thinking about with those accounting ethical considerations.
Yep, Janice, I'm gonna do one more. I should just cut it off so we can get to the case studies, but I want to talk, and I'll keep it brief, I promise. I want to talk a little bit about the rewards and incentives side, because it ties into what we've talked about earlier with incentives being part of creating an ethical environment. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. What I want to point out from a ethics perspective, and really it's a general business perspective, most organizations, not all, many organizations set goals sometime for their employees in late 2019. Those goals which were set out in many organizations specifically drive incentive compensation. Meeting those goals will drive incentive compensation when it comes time for that. But many organizations have not really stopped and gone back and said, the world has changed. Therefore, what has changed in terms of the goals and objectives that were set out for this group of individuals, this class of employees, if you will? And are we now going to build an incentive compensation program that's based on achieving goals that are less relevant now than they were then? And when individuals know what drives their incentive compensation, and they know what they need to do to achieve a certain number, and many organizations have a very fixed incentive compensation process, from an ethical perspective, is it likely or possible that employees will either focus their time on something that's less important, even though they know it's less important because it drives incentive comp, or will they bend a little bit on making sure things can check the right box to drive greater incentive compensation, when really some of those things aren't critical and there are other critical behaviors that need to be incentivized. So my comment and my encouragement is that if you haven't already, you revisit and make sure that incentives that are driven by a goal setting process, that you've revisited how those might be impacted, and make sure that you're giving employees clear direction on what they should and shouldn't be doing if that is changed in context of the pandemic and the remote work environment, and the things that we're facing now that we may not have been facing when you set those goals. So that's it. I'm not going to talk about any of the other ones, Janice, but I will let you roll with one or two more if you want.
I really liked preserving confidentiality and the things you need to consider with who could be around during your Zoom or Teams or whatever electronic method you use, and are people printing things at home. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because I think some of our case studies will talk about that. So I'm ready to move on if you are, Mike.
I'm ready.
All right. I believe that takes us up. I got to advance the slides one more. Takes us to our next polling question. So get ready, CPE question number 2. This is about working remotely. So are all of your employees working entirely remotely? Some organizations can do that. Most employees are working remotely with a few on site. Most employees are working on site with a few remotely. Or are all employees working on site? I know there are certainly some industries where that is the case, and certainly I work with some healthcare organizations where the majority of their employees are on site and are needed to be on site. So I realize this could vary pretty dramatically, but we look forward to hearing the point of view and where you're all coming from.
And while you are deciding which of those 4 buttons to click, and it doesn't need to be scientific, just, gut feels okay. While you're doing that, please be reminded that if you have any questions as we go, you can use the question feature and raise those questions, and we will address them at the end of the webinar should we have time. But don't forget to lodge those questions and we'll do our best. So you've got about 15 seconds, 10 seconds left, and we're not going to count down. But all right, Janice is going to count down apparently. So we're down to 5 seconds. So click quick or you are out of luck.
All right, most employees are working remotely with a few on site. So I think that's what I would expect. That's what I'm seeing with a lot of the companies that we work with, and certainly the ones that can do that, some cannot. And so we see the second highest choice with most employees working on site with a few remotely. Certainly a lot of your administrative functions can be done remotely, and that lends itself to a lot of organizations. But that's what I would have expected. Is it for you, Mike?
It is. I think it's consistent with outside of a few core industries where folks just absolutely need to be in, and a few outliers where folks are working entirely remotely. The office has become unnecessary. Yeah, I think the vast majority of the organizations I interact with are in that category.
Great. So now we get to go into some case studies, or as I might call it, food for thought. So we're going to start the first one, maybe a little more technical accounting, but certainly some ethical choices here. So PPP loans, paycheck protection loans. Our firm's done a number of webinars and a series of explaining these and how to apply and how you get them. But there are definitely some ethical choices in there. So your company is deciding whether or not to apply. I think we're past this stage, but there was certainly a thought process there of the current economic uncertainty needs to make this loan request necessary for your ongoing operations. And you also had to certify that funds will be used to retain workers. So certainly there were, a lot of organizations saying, is this absolutely necessary for our organization? We definitely saw some organizations out there that were sort of challenged on that, or, the power of public opinion that gave the money back in the window that they had, that Maybe they thought they needed it initially and then realized that they didn't. I'd like to think they were still making ethical decisions and said, you know what, it's not as bad as we thought. But they were certainly faced with that ethical dilemma. And I do know organizations that said, you know, I really just can't certify to the fact that we absolutely need this money to stay afloat. But there certainly is a thought process of, you know, is this an advocacy threat? Like, are you advocating for your organization? Because, quote, this is free money. Why wouldn't I go get this money? And you definitely had to think through the ethics on that decision. I also think of another threat of undue influence from the Code of Professional Conduct. So is someone in the organization putting pressure on you? You're part of the accounting department or the team, and you're trying to follow the code and do the right thing ethically. And are they saying, no, 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 go get us that loan. We need this money, when maybe you don't. And then you had to get into, are we going to use the funds as they are required to be used? Are we going to actually retain our employees and retain our headcount? So there's some of the things you had to think about up front, and as you signed that certification, and then as you're going through the forgiveness application as well. But then there's some accounting things to look at as you're recording them. I've certainly seen this with some June 30th year ends or a 9/30 year end, or even going beyond that. You can be caught in this window of, have you truly earned the funds? Have you expended them for their intended purposes? Can you kind of prove that? So did you substantially meet the criteria to recognize the gain on forgiveness or the grant income? You certainly have some options there. And are you being swayed in any way for, if we don't take this at June 30th or at our year end, could that make us a going concern? Or could that violate our debt covenants? Or could this be contrary to what the board may be expecting? So there were definitely a lot of things to consider as you go through this PPP loan process, and certainly something unique to our current environment and something we hadn't seen in previous years. Anything you want to add to that, Mike?
I would only add, after being the guy that just encouraged everyone to lodge questions if they had them, I would remind you that we are not on this webinar in particular to answer all your questions about PPP forgiveness, but you can go to our fantastic COVID resource page on our website and get all those PPP loan related questions asked. If you have a question about the ethical component, Janice will be happy to answer it.
Great, thanks, Mike.
Good stuff. Well, now let's move on to two. And I think I would reiterate from a case study perspective, these are really just food for thought as it relates to things that we need to think about differently. I don't think anything we'll talk about over these 5 case studies is new or amazing or rocket science. It just was an opportunity for us to talk through some of the thought processes that need to be different in today's environment than they were 6, 8, 10 months ago when things were quote unquote normal. So our second case study is about expense reporting. Simply put, you're working from home and you're realizing that other employees are reporting what may be inappropriate expenses on their expense reports. So just want to take a minute and talk through the ethical thought process and really the judgment that is made that may be a little different now. So the things I would encourage in order of priority, one is to simply consider the circumstances and the nature of the expense. So we talk about, or the question is asked, are the expenses justified? And I think it's fair to assume that there will be things in today's environment, in a remote work environment, that would be an appropriate purchase, an appropriate employee expense, an employee expensing something to the company in this environment that would not have existed in a traditional in-office process. So I think that's the first step. The first step is really to critically step back and think, what are the circumstances and what am I seeing? Now, is it logical that someone would be buying $200 worth of snacks for the office when nobody's in the office? Probably not. But there's a lot of other expenses, maybe for work from home type things, maybe reams of paper to print things at home that would have never been expensed before because there's a supply closet at the office for those things. So first is to think about the nature. Second, a phrase we use at McConley and Asbury pretty regularly is to give the benefit of the doubt. It's really to do some research in context of benefit of the doubt and not assume the worst and assume that the employees are reporting inappropriate expenses because they can. And maybe this gets back to the ethical decision-making and thought process in a work-from-home environment where maybe I'm disengaged. We talked about employee engagement earlier. And as a disengaged person, I'm seeing a little bit of wiggle room on my expense report and I'm going to get a few extra bucks. But I would encourage you to give the benefit of the doubt before you conclude. Ask the question, follow up on it. Third thing to think through is to understand, were corporate policies altered or adjusted as a result of the world we're living in? And maybe that's not a written corporate policy, and we could talk about the need for corporate policies to intentionally be updated, but if policies were updated and not well documented, we need to know that. So were corporate policies altered, and would this expense fit in today's environment? So really it's that process of thinking through, would things be okay in this environment? Would the rationale be different? I give the benefit of the doubt. I address the question directly with the employee. Then the big question is, do I report the employee? And I think the answer in a lot of cases comes down to it depends, which may not be the right answer. If it depends because you're just, it's just really sort of, you could make an argument that's a fine expense and you're going to overlook it, and you would overlook it for everybody, I think that's reasonable. But if it's it depends because I trust Janice, and Janice has always been a kind of stand-up person, but if Mike had that same expense, I'd probably report it. Then the answer is it should be reported. But you really need to think of it in terms of an independent analysis, not thinking about the person, but thinking about, would I report this if it was a different person? And would I report it if it were a little bit bigger dollar amount? Is it okay if I overlook $100, but if it were $200, no way Janice is buying that many snacks? So clearly there's potential exposure if you're questioning it. So you need to understand, and if you're an employer and you have an employee who's seeing these things, you need to make sure in a remote work environment, you're empowering that employee to report appropriately what they're seeing without fear of retribution or consequences. So again, it's a, what did you change in the current environment, where you might have argued previously that you have an open door policy that anybody can come in and express their concerns, but you're working from your home office or in your living room, and an employee may or may not have access to you the way they used to. So have you adjusted and adapted your policies? So just things to think about as you go through things like this. This is going to be a very common one in today's environment. So Janice, over to you for the next one.
Great, thanks, Mike. So I'm going back a little more to the accounting side, the specifics of that. And so this looks at some of the government funding. So there's a lot of government funding out there. We talked about PPP loans in the last example. There's grants that are coming through. There's Healthcare Enhancement Act funds. There's the Economic Injury Disaster loans. And certainly we work with a lot of nonprofit organizations and healthcare organizations. And there is certainly a concept of no double dipping allowed. So healthcare organizations, for example, may have gotten money or revenue grants to cover lost revenue during certain periods of time. And they want to make sure that these organizations don't go out of business, and they're here to serve the community and to provide a much needed service. But those organizations have to go through an exercise and say, I'm not taking other government grant funding and other sources, whether it's under your single audit, or I'm not taking paycheck protection loan funds or things like that to cover the same types of expenditures. So I think you need to look at, is the funding necessary? Have the requirements of each of those different buckets of funding been met? And can you truly demonstrate that? And are you making sure that you're not using different pools of funds to cover the same types of expenditures? So again, this can come back to, like I said before, the advocacy threat. You've got money in the bank account, organizations have given it to you. You have a responsibility to demonstrate how you've used that. But certainly most of you would want your organization to have that money and to be able to utilize it for financial stability in the future. But you need to be able to make sure that it is necessary funding to keep the organization going. You also have the undue influence threat. So if someone's saying, you're going to make a case for this and you're going to make sure we don't lose a dollar of those funds. So hopefully that's not happening in any of your organizations, but you can certainly see how there might be different types of pressures created through these environments. So anything you want to add to that, Mike?
Not a thing, Janice. not a thing.
All right. So again, more things to think about and consider in this different environment. So case study number 4, back to you, Mike.
Yep, number 4 is really, again, back to the idea of an employee and how we interact with employees. So Janice got the ones on how you're all getting new monies from places you didn't think you'd get them before to help bridge the gap during the downturn and the challenges. Mine are a little bit more focused on the employee component of things being different and how we think through them. So this question is really about flexibility. It's about an organization that is now in that bucket of mostly working remote or all working remote, or maybe just 1 or 2 people working remote, and how a culture of flexibility might feel a little different now. So a culture of flexibility pre-pandemic might have felt like, I'm not worried if you come in at 7 o'clock in the morning and leave at 4:30, or if you come in at 9 and leave at 7 o'clock. Or if you need to leave in the middle of the day to go to a band concert or something, a doctor's appointment. That was flexibility then. Flexibility in a work from home environment feels very different, because we don't know that somebody on our team is necessarily getting up and leaving the office at 2 o'clock to go to an appointment and popping their head in our office and saying, hey, I need to leave for 2 hours, but I'm going to work from home a little later, or I'll be back. So it's a little different now. So when we have this circumstance, and what you see on the screen, an employee that is often unable to be contacted during the workday, is non-responsive, but is really doing good work. It just seems like maybe they're not doing work at the normal hours. And the key on this particular case study that I also want to focus on is this idea that deadlines have been pushed and occasionally missed, because I think they're 2 different equations. The first part, the question is, does it even matter? The work's mostly getting done. I think that is a challenge from a communication perspective and from a corporate policy perspective as to how did you define flexibility? Because one of the beautiful things about working from home is that you're not tied to being in the office from certain hours. But if your corporate expectation is that hours at home are the same as the hours if you were in the office, therefore, I expect you, quote unquote, at your desk from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. or some variant of that, or maybe there's some flexibility on either end of that, but you're there all day. Have you communicated that that is still the case? And if you haven't, I would again encourage, I've said it before, the benefit of the doubt. Flexibility from home for some people feels like I'm going to work for 3 or 4 hours in the morning, and then I just am kind of the personality that needs a pretty significant break. So I'm going to disappear for the afternoon, but I'm going to pick it up after dinner and work until midnight. And that just feels better for me. And I'm freed with this environment. I love this environment. I feel like it's conducive, and I'm going to do an awesome job for you, my boss, but it's just not going to be during your traditional office hours. Many people are embracing that as part of this world we're in today. But I get back to the communication question. Have we communicated clearly what's expected? And if somebody is not living up to our expectations, have we given them the benefit of the doubt and talking through what do we need to do differently? And every individual is different. Some employees very easily transition to this remote environment. This flexibility is a godsend because they can get work done more effectively and efficiently because they can fit their schedule instead of worrying about kind of the norms of a office hours. Other employees on your team may thrive on structure and may thrive on that 9 to 5 mentality and shut it down at 5 o'clock and are just struggling in this world of flexibility. So you need to understand how everybody's getting influenced, impacted by this. And the most important thing to me is ensuring that you communicate. So question number 2, I think we've answered, is the thought process different in a remote environment? The last one, and this, when Janice put these initial slides together, this idea of do accommodations need to be made for childcare or other responsibilities. Janice, for those who don't know, is our designated HR partner at the firm. So because of time, I'm not even going to turn the mic over to you to answer this. The answer is yes. accommodations need to be made, but you're not getting the answers on today's webinar, you should go to your HR department or legal counsel to make sure you understand what your obligations are under the CARES Act and Families First Act and things that have dictated what you need to do and be careful of in this particular world we're living in. Is that fair to move on from that, Janice?
That's fair, Mike.
All right, so in the interest of wrapping up here timely, I want to move on to case study 5, which is IT focused. And really this idea of employees working in different locations with various degrees of privacy. But in this case, employees are working the required hours and getting their tasks completed on time. So I want to make sure and just really summarize into a couple of key points on this particular case study. First, the question of should there be concerns of working in public spaces, and is it okay to have special rules related to security? I want to make sure that as a participant, you're stepping back and thinking about this in two very different ways. There's a very significant difference between IT security and between confidentiality. And I think if we lump them together, we're apt to think an employee working from a public space might be taking a little more risk than I like in terms of confidentiality, but we're going to give them some instruction to try and be careful and make sure their screen's not visible, etc. But we also recognize that that employee is taking a risk in security. And I may not be as comfortable with bending my corporate rules on security as I might be on confidentiality, depending on the data you're working with. Now, if it's private health information, that's non-negotiable. If it's internal spreadsheets they're doing that you don't want really anybody to be looking over their shoulder and just peering at, is that the end of the world? That's a corporate decision to make. But I would encourage you to think about two different levels of instruction for your employees. One is related to acceptable behavior related to confidentiality, but it's a very different discussion on IT security, and both are important, but you may want to bend differently on one than you would on the other. Regardless of that, that idea of number 3 gets back to what we've talked about, or the question number 3 gets back to what we've talked about over and over, which is, are you communicating? Employees are working differently. Some of them are working on their couch. Some of them have a private home office. Some of them are going to Starbucks and wearing their mask all day. Some are working from the park. Everybody's different. Some are coming to the office. But the security posture of where that employee is working can be vastly different from employee to employee. Policies have largely been driven in corporations, assuming that the security posture of where our employees are working is all very similar. So you need to be thinking through where the different risk points are and communicating clearly that what your pre-pandemic rules were probably are insufficient for the world we're living in today. So revisit that with your IT director. And with that, 257, we're going to move on to the
last
final
polling question. Yep, final question. We'll get this in before 3 o'clock. So here it is. Which case study discussion did you find the most beneficial? As we talked about the PPP loans and some of the ethical decisions in applying, but then also the recording of that. We talked about expense reporting. Is it appropriate? Is it inappropriate? Maybe a little more rationalization could occur in this type of remote environment. We talked about government funding and making sure that we're utilizing the funds appropriately for the intended purposes and not crossing or commingling or double dipping with some of those funds. We talked about flexibility while we're working remotely. Are you flexible? Are you not a flexible organization? Where are the boundaries? What does that need to look like? And how are you communicating that? And we talked about information technology. We talked a lot more about security and different levels of security from different locations, but we also wanted you to consider confidentiality and the preservation of the confidentiality of that data. So 5 more seconds, 4, 3. Make sure you get your responses in. So flexibility while working remotely. Good job, Mike.
Hey, Janice, I'm not, I'm not a mathematician or anything, but I think the 3 that I led got way more upvotes than the 2 you led. Just say.
Yes, they did. Thanks, Mike. So I think that concludes our webinar today. I will advance the slides for us so we can finish on time. There we go. There's Mike and I's contact information if you need to reach out to us with any questions. So on behalf of McConley and Asbury, thank you for joining us for this webinar. If you have any further questions, as I said, please contact Mike or I. We're happy to assist you in any way possible. So a recap of today's presentation and the slides will be on our website within the next few days. And as we know, several of you were participating for those all desired and required ethics CPE. So those certificates, assuming you answered the 3 polling questions, will be sent out within the next 2 weeks. So thanks so much for joining us today. I hope we entertained you slightly, and we are wrapping up on time. Have a great afternoon.